Hello and welcome. My name's Ben Judah. I'm a Senior Fellow here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and welcome to our weekly conversations. Today, the European Council is meeting in Brussels, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dave Keating, the Europe correspondent for France 24, and, of course, a non-resident Senior Fellow at our Europe Centre. Dave, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Hi, Ben. Nice to see you.
I'm really curious to begin this conversation. Really, the question for listeners in the United States: what exactly are the European Council meetings, and why do they matter?
Yeah, so this particular summit just wrapped up. These are the meetings of all 27 national leaders. They come here to Brussels 4 times a year to discuss whatever the big important issues are of the day. So that's usually the prime ministers, but for presidential systems like France, that's the president. And I think sometimes there's an impression probably that started during the debt crisis of around circa 2010, that these summits are called as emergency summits where they have to discuss a crisis. It just so happened that we had a lot of crises here over the past decade, but actually under the treaties, the leaders have to come here 4 times a year to hold these regular summits.
Tell me, what were the topics that were discussed at the summit?
So at this summit, there were 3 main issues. They were the Ukraine war and the recent developments with the Wagner Group, migration and this new migration pact that was just able to be agreed after years of trying, and also a discussion of how the EU should orient itself toward China, and particularly discussion on Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's idea of de-risking, which has actually become quite popular on both sides of the Atlantic. This idea that you should de-risk your contacts and connections with China, but not decouple from China.
Let's start with Ukraine and Russia. What were the main divisions over what the EU's policy towards these places should be?
Generally, the EU has been very united when it comes to the Ukraine war, but there's one major exception, and that is Hungary's Viktor Orban. He has maintained a close relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He has kind of refused to support Ukraine, cast skepticism about who is to blame for the war, talked about Russia having legitimate security concerns, and that's why it acted. And he can actually veto most of what the EU has done for Ukraine, because there are just a couple of issues on which unanimity is needed for passing EU legislation. That is areas of foreign policy is the big one. Taxation is another one. So really all the things that have had to be decided when it comes to Ukraine have had to be decided by unanimity, in particular sanctions against Russia. And Hungary has been quite difficult about that. Now, in the end, Hungary has been kind of given things to end its threatened veto each time. But right now they have an outstanding veto on a new tranche of funding to aid Ukraine. They have not dropped that veto yet. As far as I can tell, they didn't really make much progress on that today. So that veto is still hanging around out there. And that is the consistent dynamic whenever the European Council talks about Ukraine, is it's Orban versus everybody else.
So let's talk about the Migration Pact. What are the contours of that?
So earlier this month, the interior ministers of the EU were able to agree by a majority vote this migration pact. This was negotiated by Sweden, which is currently holding the rotating presidency of the EU Council. And it's, among other things, it's essentially, the big picture is that it is a crackdown on migration. It makes it easier for countries to send migrants back immediately after they arrive, to process asylum claims immediately and immediately reject them, and send them even to third countries where that migrant isn't from. But what Poland and Hungary don't like is that it would require all countries in the EU to either take on migrants that have arrived at the EU's external borders, or if they don't want to do that, to pay money to those border countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain to help them deal with the migrant influx at their borders. So Poland and Hungary voted no to that migration pact earlier this month, but they were overvoted. 4 countries abstained and the rest voted yes. That's a majority. Now they were saying, well, we're not going to support the adoption of these conclusions on migration at this summit unless you insert language saying that in the next vote, so eventually that legislation is going to work through the legislative process, and at the end of the year, there will be another vote. Poland and Hungary wanted it written into these conclusions that essentially that second vote would be by unanimity, and therefore they could veto it. Of course, the other countries weren't going to agree to that. The fact that the conclusions on migration weren't adopted at the summit, not really a big deal. The legislation still goes forward. This was really a lot of political posturing for domestic political consumption, particularly in Poland, where they have an election coming up. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki wanted to be seen to be standing up to the EU and standing against anything that might make Poland have to take in non-Polish people.
So this brings us to China. Could you tell us what the divisions were and where consensus emerged around de-risking?
Out of everything, this was the area with the most consensus. Actually, everybody likes this idea of de-risking, I think, because it can kind of mean whatever you want. So in the conclusions that they've just adopted today on de-risking, there's not a lot of specifics. It talks about, and actually just in the final press conference, President von der Leyen explained a bit what she means by de-risking, which is ending dependencies on China, lowering the trade deficit with China, making sure that China isn't acquiring sensitive assets. I think those are fairly non-controversial ideas. The question is, how do you do that? I think the main thing to keep in mind with de-risking is it was introduced as a way to say this is Europe's unique policy toward China, kind of echoing Macron's statements on his return trip from China about 2 months ago, when he said that Europe needs its own policy on China, shouldn't just blindly follow whatever the US is saying to do. And I think that this idea that decoupling is what the US was asking Europe to do, and this is Europe's counteroffer, saying, well, how about de-risking? But what's interesting over the past 2 months is I've seen this de-risking idea, at least the word, the jargon, catch on across the Atlantic in the US. So it seems like there's a lot of consensus around this idea. They just have to flesh out what it means.
That's really interesting. In terms of looking at other countries' views of what's happening, there's been a lot of commentary in Britain this morning about how the EU is moving to the right on migration. Kind of curious for your reaction on that.
For sure, the EU is moving right on migration. I think that ideas from someone like Giorgia Meloni, the far-right Italian prime minister, that would have been considered beyond the pale just a couple of years ago are now mainstream ideas. And actually, on this migration discussion, you had a letter kind of organized by Denmark, by the prime minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, saying that the EU should develop, quote, innovative solutions for solving the migrant crisis. And a lot of people are reading that to mean border walls and detention camps in third countries. Now, a lot of countries have problems with that. I talked to a lot of diplomats on Wednesday who said they think that violates international law and is morally deplorable. But what's interesting to know is Mette Frederiksen is technically on the center left. She's a social democrat. And so even these ideas that could come out of the mouth of Meloni are being embraced by some on the center left now. And really with the way Meloni is now orienting herself here in Brussels as very much the moderate, the center right person, reasonable. She has a totally different face when she's here in Brussels than when she's in Rome. You really can't tell much difference between far right Giorgia Meloni and center left Mette Frederiksen. So I think a lot of these ideas, when it comes to migration, there is more of a consensus building, and that consensus is definitely on the right end of the spectrum.
Dave Keating, thank you so much for joining us from the heart of Europe.
Thank you.